There was a village which was once terrorized by a dragon, and the only way to appease it was to give it a sheep every day. But one day the village ran out of sheep, so it wanted something else. It wanted children, and so the king of the land said, yes, give up your children for the dragon. But soon it came to the day that the king had to give up his own child for the dragon, and the king didn't want this. And so he called for the help of a warrior, and this warrior was George. And he came along and he slew that dragon, and for that he became a saint. The dragon myths of around probably 10 to 12,000 years ago, Tiamat and Apsu of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers going into the Persian Gulf, the dragons we see in Indo-European texts. We have Ingri, which is the proto-indo-european dragon, but we also see dragons like Vitra, but we also have lots of dragons in classical texts in Greek. Yeah, so you have Zeus versus Typhon. Perseus, he killed the Ethiopian sea monster, but then you also get Hercules killing Aegon, I think it is, who was a dragon, and that's to get cattle, or different layers of the myth, almost like an archaeology of literature. The dragons or the serpents of Apsu and Tiamat changing, and that can only happen because of Indo-Europeans, because Indo-Europeans became key pastoral farmers. And what we find is that the story of the enumeration of Apsu and Tiamat, where these are serpents in water, actually changes, and we actually have a tablet of the enumeration, sort of one discovered, I think it was in the 60s, which actually describes Tiamat as a cow.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. And I'm with Jon F. White from Kreckenford, who is his channel is one of the best, guys. If you haven't figured out Kreckenford by now, you're living under a rock. Go and subscribe. Links in the description. That is one of my favorite channels. Just awesome content. And without further ado, I got a question for you, because this show Game of Thrones is out now. The new season's out, and I'm watching this this talk show host. He's talking about Game of Thrones, and he mentions an old legend from St. George. And he's talking about how maybe it's possible, we don't know for sure, but maybe it's possible that the author of Game of Thrones maybe could have been influenced by this legend of St. George. What do you know about St. George?
Well, St. George, patron saint of England, is known here for slaying a dragon. So that's maybe where some of the influence comes from, the dragon. But what's quite interesting about St. George is that because this is an old story, we see it evolve. And as we see this story evolve through time, and we see it evolve through not only stories, but through paintings of the story, which are very popular, we actually see how dragons change. And so the dragons we see on shows like the Game of Thrones, these big, scaly winged monsters that breathe fire, are very different to the dragons that St. George was slaying 500 years ago, which are the size of a pig, a little green thing with tiny wings. And you just see as stories get elaborate and pop culture comes along, the dragon slowly grows and grows into this wonderful beast. But actually, the story of St. George itself isn't the original dragon story. And you often, so the main story you hear of this is like the dragon steals a princess or kidnaps a princess, and the knight in shining armor comes along, kills the dragon to rescue the princess. But the actual original story wasn't that. Princesses weren't really a valuable commodity that dragons would take. Dragons would normally take cows, because cows were an important commodity. So the knight in shining armor was actually a warrior who went off to slay the dragon to get his cows back.
Wow.
But that isn't even the first, but you'll know of other stories. Certainly your viewers, if are familiar with the biblical stories or the Rig Veda, you'll actually see that dragons have a lot to do with water as well. And that's the very original myth. And what we see, and we can talk about today, is that how dragons came from controlling water, which was important to us, to controlling cattle, because cattle became important to us, to controlling princesses, because princesses became important to us.
Right. And then you also get You also get the flying aspect coming later. I've noticed that the Alexander romance early on, this might be one of the earliest depictions of a flying giant dragon, because that's like you said, going because this is we're talking 4th century BCE,
Mm.
maybe for 1st century. But this is like a rolling text, might even be later than that. But like before that, if you go back to 5th century, 6th century BCE, like you said, the dragons don't really you don't really have these giant beasts yet, or do we?
Um, no, they are occasionally called giant, but what we have to bear in mind is when things are called giant, they aren't necessarily giant. So, also talk about this. Giants themselves aren't necessarily giants. Giants have been described as being the size of dwarves,
Yeah,
as well
yeah,
as
yeah.
being the size of people, as well as being big. And the same is true of dragons. So we can see in biblical texts or alike that the Leviathan or whatever is called massive. In
Right,
fact, the in Innumerary Leash, where you have Tiamat slain and then made into the earth, Tiamat must have been massive. Otherwise, how could the earth be created? So
right,
you assume they're big, but actually all the depictions of them have them looking pretty mediocre. And I
right,
don't know if that's just an artistic way of doing it. Because how do you draw a massive dragon on as a picture? Everything
right,
else is
yeah,
really tiny.
right,
You can't do that.
right,
So and that's it. But you'll see the myths definitely evolve as society evolves and as culture evolves and religion evolves. And it's a really clear example of that. And it's an interesting story as if you could follow the dragon myth around the world to see how our cultures and religion changed, and certainly particularly from the dragon myths of around probably 10 to 12,000 years ago to now has it's undergone the most change from the Tiamat and Apsu of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers going into the Persian Gulf, grown into what we see in the Bible from the Leviathan and Behemoth to the dragons we see in Indo-European texts, where we have Ingri, which is the proto-indo-european dragon, but we also see dragons like Vutra. But we also have lots of dragons in classical texts. In Greek, for example, you have all these different flavors as well. So I know you're quite well read on the Greek. Yeah, so you have Zeus versus Typhon, which we often consider a sort of dragon slaying myth, but you also have Perseus. He killed the Ethiopian sea monster, but then you also get Hercules killing Aegon, I think it is, who was a dragon, and that's to get cattle. So you actually see the myth or different layers of the myth, almost like an archaeology of literature, because it ends up with people like Medusa and who all sort of infer a dragonness about them because of the serpents on their head.
right,
And that actually then goes into the goddess of death. So Indo-Europeans had a goddess of death who's called Koliol, and that turned into Nordic hell and the like. And that was a woman who was rotten and had snakes associated with her. So you see the dragon turn into a female goddess.
right.
So yeah, there's all sorts. So we can go into any of those if you want, Neil.
Yeah, I want to. One more thing I want to throw by you just to set the stage, and we'll jump into a bunch of this stuff, because there's also the idea of the Milky Way itself being a giant dragon in the sky. Because when you look up at the Milky Way, it sort of looks like it's one big entity. Like I
Mhm.
wouldn't be surprised if there were some ancients in certain parts of the world, maybe China, maybe somewhere else. I don't know. Maybe Native Americans. I'm just throwing stuff out there. But they're looking up at the sky and they're like, okay, maybe there's some demons, angels, whatever. But what's that thing? Because that thing
Exactly.
looks like it's one big thing. Now, how do you, it might be a dragon. Now, I know there's this Typhon, and there's people like Herodotus and Diodorus of Sicily who identify him with the Egyptian god named Seta.
Yes.
And
I
he
love
looks like
Satan.
this.
Mhm.
And here's the English version of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, where he says, I am the serpent Seta, whose years are many, and I'm born again and I die each day. And
Exactly.
like that is like so, and that's like the snake that sheds itself and comes back. So the idea of a dragon being serpentine, that sort of thing. What is all this stuff? I know I just threw a lot of stuff at you.
There's
Wherever you want to go
a
first.
lot.
Wherever you
Ready
want
to
to
go for the Milky Way to
Yeah.
say. So I'm not familiar particularly with the Milky Way being associated with dragons has been associated with emus and other such creatures, but not dragons. However, some stars are associated with dragons, and we see that certainly in the Basque region. I believe there's some cave paintings, even going back to probably the Upper Paleolithic period, where it's been supposed that the stars are reflective of a dragon story. In terms of Set, so there's a god Set in Egypt who kills a dragon for control of water, and that relates to that. But the other motif, so the things you talk about, I call motifs. We have different aspects like flying or fire breathing, or like the shedding of the skin. That's actually a motif around death. So
Right.
it was thought by our ancestors that where a snake sheds a skin, it is immortal because it's like being reborn in a new skin. And actually, those people who believed in immortality or rebirth, in fact, reincarnation, the reasons you didn't recognize your friends if they were reincarnated is because they got a new skin. And so that's why you would never actually meet someone who was reincarnated. And that's all come from that shedding of the skin piece. So that's another very important motif. But that, although it's associated with snakes, wasn't in so many dragon myths, and that actually isn't considered significant enough to be considered part of the core dragon mythos.
Sure.
The core dragon mythos is really the scaly dragon who is aggressive and who often controls water. And we see that, you say, from literally, well, we can go back to probably about 70,000 years ago for the first myths, all the way today.
Is there a reason why it controls water but also can breathe fire, or is this a later addition to what dragons do?
So the breathing fire is definitely a later addition.
Sure.
Definitely. And, we see examples of this. Who is it? I think it's Hercules and Chaos, is it? Who was Vulcan's son? Yeah. He was a fire breathing. You get that element there. And I think there may be something sort of along those storylines that sort of informed that. In terms of controlling water, there's been lots of debate about that. But the thought is that, I mean, so the idea behind dragons, or from my understanding, is that once dinosaurs died out, and dinosaurs have nothing to do with dragons, for everybody in chat who are probably saying, "Oh, dragons are just dinosaurs," there's no evidence to suggest that dinosaur bones had anything to do with the imagination of dragons. They may have helped stories later on, but they had nothing to do with the initial concept. But once dinosaurs died out, mammals and reptiles came to the front for, and mammals' biggest enemy was the snake, pretty much. And so even now, humans now, if you went for a walk outside, you would you'd be subconsciously aware of snakes around you, such as they've been built into human evolution over millions of years. And you even see this in children and that. And so we have this inherent fear of snakes. And because we're afraid of them, when we do see a snake, we often see it larger than larger than it really is, because it is important. And it takes our concentration away. So there's a lot of psychology involved in thinking, the snake's important. And then because it seems like the snake myth started by water sources, you had to get to a water source. There's sometimes snakes around, so you couldn't go there. And that probably started it. And we see that evidenced in a number of ways. One, in not only many of the original myths about the dragon are absolutely tied with the delivery of water, but the oldest and the two oldest rituals I know of, one in South Africa and then there's one in Europe, they both show the dragon being associated with a water source.
Yeah.
So we.
This is. I just wanted to show. I just probably want to pull this up. This is a very old Poseidon Mosaic, and it looks like we got some dragon imagery going on here, right?
Indeed.
Now, I mean, there might be one of them might be his son. Actually, he had a son, but he was like half dragon, half person. He was the king of pharaohs in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
I find out which one that was, but yeah, but like I'm just throwing that out there. But I didn't mean to cut you off of what you're saying. So
But you'll find it everywhere, though. Absolutely everywhere you'll find this dragon myth.
that's what I was trying to say. Like you see the images all over the place, and you don't see them talking about these being ancient animals that died off. They're just kind of mythological.
Yeah,
That
they're nearly always mythological, and that's another interesting point. You don't see well, let's say they're actually more story based rather than myth, because myths tend to be associated with truths. Stories tend to be made up, and the reason we actually think there's a difference there is that there's actually in fact, very few cave paintings of dragons from Paleolithic period. So over sort of 15,000 years ago, no one was painting dragons, and why is that? And it's thought that perhaps there's a difference between depicting a story and depicting a myth. And you want to depict myths because they hold some truth to you, but you don't necessarily want to go for the time and effort to depict a story. But saying that, there are cultures that did paint these things, such as the very earliest dragon we know of, which is in South Africa, which is painted. Well, the story, they say, think it goes back to at least 70,000 years, probably older than that, maybe even 130,000 is probably the most extreme we've got, where they show this quadruped underwater with dead people around him and living people. Then they're meant to be doing some crazy dance, and some are having nosebleeds in this ritual underwater world. And yet the tribesman who described this, and this was in, I think it was about 1840, this interview happened, he described this quadruped as a snake, which is in terms a dragon.
wow.
And so we see this underwater aspect, and then we believe, say, it's that sort of myth that then went out of Africa to the Near East, and then that flew to China and went off to China, and then from China it would have dispersed into North America, down into Australia, and then across into South America via both routes. But then it also came back went north to Siberia and then to the Near East, where it then spread into Europe and the Indo-European myth. And and what you see is that the dragon originally was the storm god. So because it controlled water, it would have been associated with a storm god. Then by the time it leaves China and heads back towards the Near East, goes to India, it loses that, and a storm god is created in the religious pantheon, and then the dragon becomes a reflex. It becomes the enemy, but controlling water. So you have a storm god fighting the dragon for water. And then when it gets to the Indo-European, you actually see it change that the god doesn't fight the dragon. You actually get a warrior fighting the dragon. And that warrior is called Trito, meaning the third person or the third man. And what you find is there are quite a few Indo-European myths around that. So if you've got an Armenian-based myth where there are actually three warriors, you have the Iranian myth or Persian myth where Thrita is the father of the son, Thrationa, who then fights the dragon, as well as having Trito in the proto-indo-european. And you'll see this third along, much as you see Manu and Yimo, man and his twin, who are the other two people in proto-indo-european mythology, also appear in those myths around the Indo-European culture.
Wow. And so so now what I want to figure out is, how do we get this archetype basically of the knight in shining armor going after the dragon?
Right.
Where do we start seeing this thing? Is this medieval? Is this before that?
That's before that. So this is definitely proto-indo-european. So so this is sort of probably 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, and this is around the cattle raiding myth, we call this. So the myth goes that the cattle were so important to our people then, the pastoral farmers of the steppes, that all cattle must be owned by them. That the all cattle were created by their gods for them. So if anybody else owned them, that was bad, and they had to get the cattle back. So they decided to get their warrior. So this is where the storm god sort of stopped fighting the dragon, and they got their warrior to fight the dragon. But the warrior had to first make a sacrifice, and that sacrifice was normally of a libation, so a drink, and that drink is what we sometimes call soma, or the mead of poetry, or you see it in Greek cultures, but this is the drink that people sometimes associate with hallucinogenics. So it looks like that is consumed. you create a rage, which then goes off to other motifs about wearing wolf skins and lion skins and becoming an animal like a war berserker in the sort of Viking world. You get this rage, and you go off, you kill this dragon, and you get the cattle back. Now that dragon was normally a multi-headed dragon, and that's where we start seeing multi-headed dragons appear in myth, and that flows back down into the Near East and into Europe. And what you also find is that the reason the warrior fought this dragon was to become immortal, and by that they would do a deed so good that their name would be spoken about in poetry, because that's how you told stories back then. We talked in poems rather than prose. And so
they would sing it too. They would sing it.
Yeah, you sing the stories. That's how you remember them. It's because you were just
campfire stuff. Campfire.
Exactly. So
not everybody has paper, and there's not a lot of ink or anything.
Exactly.
That's an expensive thing to do. So you just sing it to people, and then you memorize it. That's how you pass it down. That's why you got Homer and Hesiod and Aeschylus.
That's why everything's poetry, because it's easier to remember, and there's different rules. So the Indo-European poetry was alliterative rather than rhyming. So everything started with the same sort of letter, so it's easy to remember. But yes, if someone had wrote a poem about you, you became immortal. Your fame would not decay, was how they did it. And that's the premise of that. It was that war, and that's how we got the knight in shining armor, in effect, came. So what happened is that this warrior collecting cattle, when the cattle in poetic form, because we don't often say the actual word in poems, we use metaphor. So you see this a lot in many poems. In the Persian poems, the cattle turned into females who lactate, or females who gave milk. And so that word dahu, I think it was, or danu, when it came to the Vedic verses, and the Indics saw this, they misread women as giving milk as women. And so they wrote about women being kidnapped rather than cattle being kidnapped. And then the Greeks come along and take the Vedic poetry and then write stories about women being kidnapped. Although some of the old myths, as I said, you still get Hercules fighting a dragon to get cattle back. But so Greeks are a really interesting place to look at all these myths. But yes, that's how it develops, and that's where St. George then comes from. So St. George and the Dragon is really about a warrior getting his cows back.
Wow. Can you, for the sake of an intro that I can make, and just to tell the story, what is this? The basis of a quick paraphrase of the story of St. George.
Okay. So just
take time to say it nice and slow too.
Okay. You know. There was a village which was once terrorized by a dragon, and the only way to appease it was to give it a sheep every day. But one day the village ran out of sheep, and so it wanted something else. It wanted children, and so the king of the land said, yes, give up your children for the dragon. But soon it came to the day that the king had to give up his own child for the dragon, and the king didn't want this. And so he called for the help of a warrior, and this warrior was George. And he came along and he slew that dragon, and for that he became a saint and was knighted. And that's how we got St. George and the dragon.
Wow. And where is it? Okay, now this dragon in particular, do we have images that go back to when this thing was written, like paintings or carvings, or do we have anything, or is this all later?
So it's mainly myth from, I believe it's actually comes from Georgia, the actual story, or Turkey, this story. And this would have been probably 5th or 6th century. This probably would have started.
Is that why you get the name St. George?
It's from Georgia, almost certainly. But so it becomes a patron saint of England and Ethiopia, which are countries quite local to Georgia. So that was really useful for the church. Wow. And yeah, and I sort of lost my thread now, but yeah, that's where that comes from.
This is big, because this St. George versus the dragon myth becomes basically the archetype to what we have in Game of Thrones, with a knight and a dragon, but I mean, now you have different dragons, and some of them are good, some of them are bad. But like the point I'm trying to make is this is the original version of that.
Yes, so yeah, George R. R. Martin is obviously very good at his research,
Yeah.
and he's obviously collected a whole load of myths and taken
Oh,
the best out of them and created this really, I say, archetypical dragon for you. You know, this flying, fire-breathing, gigantic dragon who is terrifying yet kind to the right people, and then he's added the ability to be able to fly on them.
and they're divine too. They're not like the way he like. I guess that's just semi divine, because I mean the way they're born and fire and they're not. It's not like a natural. Oh, the two dragons mated and had a baby. Like no. There's eggs that are sitting there for thousands of years and they wind up in the fire, and then all of a sudden coming out of the fire you have a dragon.
Yes, there's
So
magic about
yeah,
that.
these
And
are
it isn't something a person on the street can buy off eBay sort of thing. This is a very special
big deal.
deal. Yeah, and that's how you make it special. And that's why you know it's special. But that's part of storytelling as much as like a traditional dragon mythos. Yeah, there has to be magic because no one really talks about where dragons come from in the myths. I mean, dragons are just there, and you know they're there for a purpose.
Now I'm going to ask you a hard question, and just I want to get your opinion on it. You don't have to. You're probably not going to. No one could know this. This is impossible to know. But do you think it might be possible that the idea of dragons might have some like I don't know how do I say this? There might be some sort of like subconscious memory of thousands of years back when maybe some sort of humanoid was in contact with dinosaurs. Or no? Is that just way out?
No, that's no, because humans were never in contact with dinosaurs. So
No, so there wasn't even a humanoids at all back then?
no, mammals were just mice at best back
Oh,
then
wow. So that's
when
not a
dinosaurs were around.
so
So
then okay, so that but and so they're so far away
they
that
are,
that's
but they're
not
all
even
big, strange
possible.
creatures. I mean, they're in the Ice Age, some creatures grew very large compared to today.
Yeah, and you
Yeah,
still have the Komodo dragons and stuff like
and you
that.
got Komodo dragons, you've got anacondas and other large snakes. You know, an anaconda can grow 30, 40 feet or like 10, 15 meters, you know, at the extreme. And some alligators, crocodiles
Yeah,
can be massive, you
huge.
know, and many of these creatures are associated with water.
Yeah.
And, you know, and when they're in water, they're semi hidden and ferocious. So, yeah, it's clear to see where some of these stories could have come from, you know, a mix of real experiences.
Now with the Chinese dragon,
Mhm.
this seems to be very central to a lot of their mythology.
Yes.
Have you come across this in your research at all?
Yeah, so the Chinese dragon is very much associated with the very first dragon myths around the creation of the world, which is why they're important. So the very early myths had the dragon appear into a dry world and finding a way to give water to that dry world so it flourishes. Okay, so they were good in that way, and that is what happens in basically the Australian myth of the Rainbow Serpent.
This is kind of reflected in Genesis and the Hesiod too, with the two waters.
And to what, yeah, that's slightly different, and we can talk about Tiamat and Apsu
Well,
and
it's like
the
'cause
relation, all those sort of things. Because
Tiamat and Tahom are cognates.
yep,
Tahom is the waters, the deep, the abyss.
indeed, and that's where the dragons are associated with water, but they're not giving water to the world; they're actually born in it because the myths changed a bit. Um, but yeah, so we go back to Chinese dragons. So there's so many myths, but yeah, the core concept of the myth is that the dragon, or there are a number of dragons. They see the world is very dry, and they say to the people, well, we will give you water. And what they do is they go to the sea, put water in their mouths and spray it on the land, and the land gets water and grows crops.
So
But
they have to be big then. They have to be big then.
well, you're about to find out, because what happens is the evil emperor, the Jade Emperor, who's in fact, because it's like almost like the main god, gets upset while they're doing this because he wants to control the world and the land. So he orders the equivalent, like you call him, of a storm god, but a mountain god in effect, to throw mountains on top of these dragons to crush them, to stop them flying around giving water. So he does that, but because these dragons have consumed so much water from the sea to water the land, what they do is when they're crushed in the mountain, they spit water out their mouths and create the four major rivers of China. And that's how you get the four major rivers of China flowing with water, because they were from the mountains that trapped the dragons that gave water to land in the first place.
Wow.
So dragons are good in Chinese myth, but as I say, when they came back into India, you get a reflex and a split, and so the dragon becomes the control of water, but it is the storm god who has to kill the dragon to get the water.
Now, how far back does civilization in China go compared to like proto-indo-Europeans?
Right, so the Chinese myth is probably about 60,000 years old, maybe 50. The
Wow.
proto-indo-Europeans are only 8,000 years at best, maybe 6,000.
So we're getting into so like sort of almost into civilization time at that point.
But yeah, so yes, the proto-indo-European myth has come from the Near East, and these cultures are developing rapidly over the next couple of thousand years due to farming and certainly pastoral farming. And what you find initially is that, because I get a lot of, well, I get some people say that there's no Indo-European influence into the Near East, and I say there is, and we can touch on this because you see this in Tiamat and Apsu.
Right.
Yeah. So, but you see the myth of the dragons or the serpents of Apsu and Tiamat changing, and that can only happen because of Indo-Europeans, because Indo-Europeans became key pastoral farmers. And what we find is that the story of the New Revolution, Apsu and Tiamat, where these are serpents in water, actually changes, and we actually have a tablet of the Enuma Elish, sort of one discovered, I think it was in the 60s, which actually describes Tiamat as a cow.
Oh, that's from proto-indo-European.
And that's the Indo-European influence coming in. And that whether that came from Indo-European, came south of the Near East, or came through trade with India, we certainly see that. And that's, I mean, for them to actually come up with that independent of the Indo-European seems unlikely, considering how important the cow was in Indo-European, because the cow became critical in Hindu culture. So when the Vedic turned into Hindu, there was such a big thing. So that influence has come back, and you sort of start seeing glimpses of this in Job, I guess in the Bible, where I think it's Job 41, you start talking about Behemoth, or I think it is, who's eating grass and chews a cud or something. Yeah, and it's sort of, people think, oh, it's a hippopotamus, but to me, perhaps again, that's some reflection of the cow part of the mythology that's gone to the Near East and to Babylonian culture, and then flow back into the Ugaritic and then into.
And there's the Samaveda, the Arthur Veda, and the Rig Veda is loaded with holy cows, like divine cows.
Yes, because the cow created the world, in effect, or created the creatures of the world.
Yeah, and there's the polemic of it, where in the Iranians, the Zoroastrians, the Mithraic people, you can tell they're very closely related to these Vedic people. They're probably both coming from the same source.
They are. So Indo-Iranian are very much
they polemicize each other. So in the Iranians, they kill the bull. If the bull gets slaughtered, that's the difference. The Indians like, no, you save the bull, you don't kill the bull.
Yes. What you have though is that Zoroastrianism is actually almost like a reflex of the original Persian beliefs. So the original Persian beliefs flowed into India, and then Zoroaster came up and literally changed everything. And he tried to erase all of that previous mythology. And actually, if you read the Yas and that, there's almost nothing left. But occasionally we see glimpses of the Indo-European myth still in there, where it talks about the flight of there's a soul within a person to make him king. Yeah, the Yana or something. Yana.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but yeah, there's this flight, and you see him talking about twins as well in creation, in a couple of lines. So they're just hints in there.
Yeah, you see little remnants.
Yeah, where it hasn't been quite able to get rid of it all because it's persisted within culture.
And the reason why I bring that up, when you go back far enough, I don't know, let's say 10,000 BCE, and you try to construct what the world looked like at that point, you almost can say, because I think of this game. Ever played Skyrim? There's a video game called Skyrim. This might be about the world, like the plateau of Iran, or the hills of Afghanistan, and the horde of what is now Ukraine and
Mhm.
Russia, there might have been little pocket cities of, civilizations, or not cities, but what do you call it? Like little townships or whatever, like with like farming. Is that what would you call it?
Not 10,000. 10,000 years ago, maybe just farming might be coming. Farming tended to be Near East, and it's probably about 8,000 BCE before farming really started to get to the east side of Europe. I mean, what we find before then, there is evidence of a Paleolithic dragon ritual from 17,000 years ago, found in a cave in the in French Pyrenees, so southern France. They
Oh, wow.
found caves with a headless snake in two caves. Both caves were sources of rivers, and the snake was, apart from the head, was whole. Its body hadn't been corrupted or destroyed. So, and it was at the back of a cave, so over 500 feet or 150, 200 meters into a cave. So the snake hasn't got there naturally. Someone's cut off its head, taken it to the back of a cave, and left it there. And one of these was actually left in a natural pool of water in a cave where a river's sourced.
What do you think the point of that was?
Well, that is so. That's a very good point. So if you look on this cave, there are many paintings of animals or drawings of animals, and the some of the animals don't have heads on them. So like they beheaded the dangerous animals in effect, and so it's felt that this is symbolic of the snake is symbolic of a dragon, and leaving it in the cave there by the water dead is a way of, if I make one dragon headless, then perhaps they all die and become, they're all headless and will die. So they have
Dude,
access to water.
this is so much like the story we get in the Torah, where Moses takes a serpent and puts it on a rod, and this heals you from other serpents.
Yes, it's that kind of thinking. Yeah, if you do it to one, it will do it to all. But this is 17,000 years ago. Like
Right. But still, you see the same sort of thinking
yeah.
getting passed down, maybe not directly, but definitely indirectly.
Mm.
It's this is what I'm fast. This is what you see a lot on my channel. I love to point out where I see parallels, not to get too crazy with it, but I like to point out where things are like
It's like
weirdly in common. That's
for human behavior, though. Before
right.
commercialism came along and diluted the
Yeah.
world with stuff. Yeah, and that's why I love studying mythology, is to try and find these commonalities, these
Well, it's
early
studying
beliefs.
humans. When you study mythology, you're studying humans. You're studying deep down what we feel like, what we think, what we are as a human race, what we are as a it just really it's like you said, these aren't just stories. These are stories injected with wisdom about the world. Wisdom that has been passed down from generation to generation, generation. Here's what you don't do. Don't walk up to a
Exactly.
snake, it's gonna bite you. Well, put that into a myth. Oh, don't fight the dragon, or make sure you have a sword, do this, that. There's always different little, and then it's
But
really
it
imperative.
persists, yeah, and it persists for a reason, because
Right.
it works. It held them in good stead for
It
tens of
did.
thousands of years,
It did.
and we've just almost stopped telling those myths, and that
Well, we
upsets.
didn't. We didn't. We have film now.
Well, we have film, but it's not.
But no, but think about it. Think about it. When you go to a movie, you watch a really good film, a Spielberg or someone like, I don't know, some just a really
Mhm.
amazing movie. You come out of that thing feeling the power from it. You feel some
Yes,
sort
the
of,
power of storytelling. Yes,
yeah,
oh,
the power of
absolutely.
storytelling. Exactly. And
I
that's
get
the
that.
thing. And I'm not saying they replace myths or the same thing, but they're sort of a new version of it.
So storytelling, I absolutely love. I have great admiration for great storytellers. How they tell stories. But what our stories today do is they have forgotten some of the myths, the gems, the motifs that were so important to our ancestors, and that's what I sort of miss. The reasons our ancestors did particular things have been lost because of commercialism, or very often because of Christianity coming along, and
Yeah.
that had a really good hand in wiping out a lot of knowledge and
Isn't it
ritual.
interesting how Christianity comes along and they think they're doing the world a service by replacing superstition with a better, more holy religion.
Yeah, with the cult of Christianity. Yep.
And then you have 1,000 years of kind of stagnation. And it's interesting what exactly brings us back from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment is going back to the ancient stuff, back to ancient
Exactly.
wisdom, painting I was just looking at Michelangelo's Venus painting.
Oh yeah.
That's
Well,
that's from
things on it.
that's from the Renaissance era. That's a painting of a goddess. So we needed to go backwards to go forward in that time period. That
Very
to me
interesting
is
thought.
fascinating.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. Yeah. Well, yeah. Where does Christianity isn't the future? It doesn't let you grow. It's
No, it
just a
doesn't. It's just
it's
kind of
just a load of myth in a big book, because that's what I would consider the Bible, is a book of myths. It doesn't. Yeah, it has some good stories in there. Yes, but
what it did was it sort of made the world when we had this world, this Christendom, we would call it Christendom, where there's a king here, and the Pope says you're going to marry that queen over here, and there's a royal marriage between Germany and Spain, and that keeps happening for generation, and also you had this world of everyone playing roles.
exactly,
You're,
and it's
you're
an
the court
organization. The
you're,
church was that.
yeah, you're in the court. You're a peasant. You're over here. You're a king. You're the queen, and everyone's just playing a role. Nobody has an identity anymore. It's a fake. It literally was a fake world. We're so glad we woke up out of that, actually. And but this actually ties back to the dragon thing, because this, like, being able to find images or stories that get passed down, like the dragon story, that it's just kind of crazy, because I'm calling mythology savior in a way, because being able to tell these stories and pass them down reminded us of who we are and where we came from.
Sense of
Without
purpose
the
and belief.
art,
Yeah.
yeah, without the art and the mythology and the stuff that came along before that, we wouldn't know where to turn, right?
Exactly. And I say the stories they have. The Australian one, for example, the Rainbow Serpent, very similar to the Chinese one. The Rainbow Serpent comes into a dry earth, gives it water for years and years and years, and all the plants grow and animals wake up. And then the snake wakes up the humans at the very end and says, I'm giving you this world, but if you muck it up, I'm going to destroy you and create the world again without you. And that is thousands of years old, that myth.
Yeah.
But you've already got that thing that don't destroy your world. And that's very much like the Indo-European belief of death, where and birth, where when you die, they felt your body went back to the world, like the earth. So your flesh was the earth, your bones were rocks, your hair was the grass, your blood was water. So when you died, you went to those component parts. But when you were born, it took some water from the world and some earth from the world and some rocks from the world to make your body. And they believed in that cycle, that what you take, you give back. And you actually see that there's that. I know we talked about Enoch just a little while ago, the Book of Enoch, and there's actually a reflex of this about Jesus in Enoch. I think Second Enoch, being born of rock and sea and earth, and his body's made exactly the same way as the Indo-European person, where they've taken that myth, and they say so again. It shows also Indo-European influence into the Near East, a couple of thousand years ago, to take that myth to bring it back. I think that's the Slavic version of Enoch.
Wow. I want to ask you something real quick about the Skyrim has this thing where Sovngarde, when you go to Sovngarde, there's a dragon there waiting for you to fight him. You have to fight the dragon, and it's sort of like the dragon is connected with the afterlife in this. The dragon is the god, actually. And is this based on anything from European, proto-indo-European, anything like that?
So
I know the Sovngarde things. It sort of sounds like some Nordic stuff going on there.
yeah, well, that's Skyrim is based on sort of a Nordic type land.
Exactly.
So what I say, originally the dragons were gods. The dragons were the storm god, in effect, had the storm god motif around them. But what you also found is that the dragon tended to represent the enemy. So for Indo-Europeans, there is a thought that the three-headed, six-eyed Ingwe serpent was a direct reflection of the three-headed god worshipped in the Indo-Mediterranean region at the time. And so because those people who worshipped the three-headed god had cattle, that made the dragon, the three-headed serpent, they had to kill to get that cattle back. So you see that imagery sort of transposed into myth in that respect.
Do you think the three-headed dragon from Revelation has anything to do with this?
That could be influenced, but you often see seven-headed dragons as well, because seven is quite a key number, I think, in Judaism, and so I think it's just whatever the author was his lucky number at the time, and that's the number of heads the dragon got. So
yes, and sort of this idea of the dragon in Christianity sort of becomes an idea of like chaos, evil, everything that's wrong.
That's that's part of the water. Well, you got two myths. You got the snake in the Garden of Eden, and you've got the Tiamat Apsu chaotic waters. And the chaotic waters is just a general theme of water and controlling water, and that's partly due to, we believe, the floods. So when it rains and floods, land is destroyed, vegetation destroyed, your crops are destroyed, people are killed, and it's that makes water seem like chaos, and that's where much of that myth comes from.
And that's ironic too, because the one thing that makes your plants grow can also kill your plants.
Exactly. And it's which is why it needs to be controlled, and perhaps one reason why they put a storm god to kill the dragon, to make the myth work more effectively, rather than just letting the dragon go wild. So that's that chaos. But the snake in the Garden of Eden, that's slightly weird. That's a real change of aspect, because the snake isn't actually, well, they call it a serpent, I think, rather than a
they call it serpent.
So it's reflective of that, but it isn't controlling water, it's controlling an apple and access to knowledge. So in effect, it's almost a similar kind of story evolved, but not controlling water, controlling apple and knowledge. And it's quite clever if that is why they made that story there. They just changed, it's the treasure to be won.
Yeah. Now, what was I going to say? I had something I was going to say. Oh yeah, and the idea that a dragon can be like, I don't know where I'm getting this from, but for some reason I'm thinking lakes and rivers, when you look at them from a bird's eye view, they can look like a serpent.
Yep.
Is there any myths like that anywhere?
Absolutely. So that's quite a well-known motif, that is considered that the path of a river follows where a snake has slivered, in effect. So this is it's particularly like this in the Australian Rainbow Serpent myth. As the snake crawls on the dry land, it creates burrows and mountains as the earth moves, and that's why the land is shaped as it is. But that motif is still really, again, we see that in Africa and Asia and Europe, that motif. So it isn't looking at the river, that's a snake. It's that, the river's like that because a big snake has gone there before. And we see those. That's one of the popular motifs.
Well, I'm trying to think. Is there anything else that you want to throw out there regarding these? This is so far. This has been great.
It touches on so much. It's very. We've been all over the place.
I'm trying to get an overview on where these dragon myths come from, where they little points to each one of them, kind of, but not like getting too deep into one thing. But
So what we need to know is that dragon myths have been around pretty much as long as human civilization, and as long as reasonably modern man has existed. So it's a very important, almost built-in motif. But what we do find is that the dragon myth does have an origin. It's unlikely to have been a sort of an archetypical view from various cultures all coming up with the same idea. So we can see this dragon myth disperse along with human migration. So that's one thing to know about them. We then see that dragon myth evolve from the dragon being the controlling object of water and deciding what to do with it, to changing into someone forcing it to let go of water. So the dragon stops being the god and becomes the enemy, and our god, if it sees it, destroys it. And then we see the myth evolve further in Indo-European times, where the god stops fighting the dragon and the warrior then comes along, and that's where we get the modern day story. So that's the key concepts for the dragon, and the dragon is a snake scaly creature who is aggressive, but in terms of motifs of flying and fire breathing and magic and controlling treasure and the like, they're really very depending on the culture and the time you've taken the myth from.
So I want to just throw one more thing at you real quick. So there's the idea, like in the House of Dragon, for example,
Hmm?
you have emblems.
Yes.
And in the medieval world, like this is from Poland.
Hmm?
The medieval world, and even Hong Kong has one like this too.
Yep.
So it's not even just the West or the East, it's all over the place. You have these emblems of dragons. Do you see, like, when does this start happening?
So, so there's two things to note. One is the dragons of Europe tend to only have 2 feet or 2 legs. The dragons of Asia have 4. So that's the difference between a wyvern.
There's only 2.
Yeah, it's a wyvern rather than a dragon. And so you can see how the East and the Asian myths have then influenced Europe as time goes on, and the dragons turn up with 4 feet. Yeah, and so that's one thing just to notice on the side.
And check this out. Ready? So this is the Hong Kong one.
Am I right? Am I right?
Just exactly what you said was right. And you didn't even I didn't even show you this. This is just we're just on the fly. But yeah, here it is. It's it actually has a you have 4 4 legs. 4 yeah.
And what's interesting is
that's definitely an Asian dragon. You can tell by the way it's got the hair and all that.
Exactly. And the hair, and that's it. So human hair was quite common on dragons from Africa into Asia, and then was lost as it went into Mesoamerica. So, but if you actually compare Quetzalcoatl, image that to maybe a green Chinese dragon, you'll see them very similar. That isn't coincidence. That is because we expect human migrations from China down into Oceania, then went off about 10,000 years ago to Mesoamerica. So they took that form of Asian dragon 10,000 years ago to Mesoamerica. But in terms of the Central American dragon that we're familiar with, we don't really know much about it. I think the oldest representation we have is about 500 BCE of a dragon, but there's very little known about that. And after that, it's a local story of how it evolved.
Now, Quetzalcoatl, did I say the name right?
Quetzalcoatl, yeah.
How old is this god? This is the supreme god of what? The Mayans?
Well, it's older than that. So no one knows where it comes from. In fact, it's probably so important. That's why it hasn't been mentioned, which is why I don't know. So basically, you'll find that cultures don't talk about their gods if they're common de facto things. It's just everybody knows it, so there's no point writing about it. So our view is that Quetzalcoatl was probably an incredibly important god because he isn't mentioned, but does appear places. But the oldest representation we've got is about 500 BCE in a carving.
Oh, is this it right here? Let me see. Let's see if you can. Let's see. This is it. This one.
That's the one. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. You're good call. You're on it today, dude. Every time you mention something, I look it up, and it's the same thing. Yeah. That is an old one right there. Yeah.
Yeah. We don't say know the origin of that because obviously there was no writing back then alike, but we just know it was an important god. It almost certainly came from China as the people migrated down to Oceania and into.
Yeah, you see a lot of commonality between the Asians and
the hairy parts of it, and that stuff that you don't get elsewhere. So you can see that, and you actually
some people try to say that they look like Egyptian stuff. I'm like, nah, they look more like Asian stuff.
Exactly, and we can tell that with DNA as well. So we can actually see the DNA traces of people migrating at the time go to Mesoamerica, which is that's how we do it. So
the science is
exactly. Or we've got very confident. It's probable that that's the case. So. I don't know how we got into those dragons. But yeah. Oh yes, the Chinese. But why are they important? Why do you have emblems? Because they're powerful. Because they're in charge of water. Yeah. If you've got a dragon as your emblem, they also know you control something important. And that's it. Much like leaving a snake in a rock pool 17,000 years ago in a cave. You were in control of the snake. You're representing the serpent, and that's your mark.
Yep. Yeah. Interesting. Well, that's all the questions I got. If anything you want to promote that's coming up, any videos you have coming up?
It's Halloween soon, so I'll probably be doing a few videos on happy topics like death, witches, and Halloween itself. So if you fancy a laugh, stick on this channel with Neil and Gnostic Informant. If you fancy being scared, then come on over to Krakenford.
You just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.